Okay, we're now going to look at something that's fundamentally essential to coding, and that's when you're coding in any language, and those are variables. Variables essentially you can think of as data that you store. So for example, what I'm going to show you here is creating just a basic variable. I always prefer to show through doing rather than explaining, so we can really get stuck in. I'm going to create a variable. It's basically like a very small block of data that we're giving a name to, and we're storing some kind of information. That information might just be a number, or it might be a bit of text, or maybe a long list of objects, like a list of numbers or a list of different bits of text. It can be a range of things, and we'll go into that in a future lecture. But for now, we're going to look at something very basic. So just like when we create functions, which we've done before, we give it a function name, whatever we want, my function, or whatever we please. We can do that, right? So now we're going to create a variable. Now to do that, we have to give it a name. So we put in var to say it's a variable, and then we can give it whatever name we want. I'm just going to call it my variable. Okay, it can be whatever you want, but I'm just going to call it that for now. Now I'm going to put equals. So this is the value that I want to store in my variable. I'm just going to put the number 20, for example. Okay, so we now have a variable, and maybe that doesn't seem very important right now, but as you'll see over the coming lectures and throughout this module, and then when we get into using Python as well, you'll see just how essential it is. It's used absolutely everywhere, and this is actually it can be used to show you some more functionality of when we're creating our own functions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a function here. Let's go with function, my function, and then here's where things get interesting. Okay, I'm going to put in just some random name. So I'm going to put in a value. Okay, so the empty brackets are no longer empty. So I'll show you what's going on here in my function now. Let's say that we want to change the HTML. We want to change, let's add a paragraph in here. Let's put in P. This is a para. So we want to change that. We want to change it to some kind of value. So what I'm going to do is, let's just change the ID of this as well. So ID equals para. That'll do. So then we want to do document.get element by ID, and we'll call this para, and then let's change the inner HTML to whatever we like. We can say just working for now, so we can just see that it's working. So, and let's add here on mouse over, like one of the events we were just looking at before, and then we'll call this function, which is called my function, with the empty brackets for now. And let's remove that for now. We'll add that in a second. So now when I go over, okay, that's working, fantastic. So what if we want to add, we don't know the exact text that we want to add straight away. Well then, what we can put in here, like I said, is a value. Then instead of putting actual text in here, we put a value here. Okay, now stay with me. It takes a few times in order to really understand what's going on here. But essentially I'm creating a function, and I'm saying in this function a certain value needs to be put in, and this is where it's going to be used in the function. Now remember, it doesn't matter what I call this again. This could be called blah blah blah. It really doesn't matter. So all that matters is that this here in the brackets is used somewhere in the function. Otherwise it just wouldn't be used anywhere, and what's the point? So now we have this my variable though. So what we could do is using this my variable, we can put this in where we're calling the function. So my variable, and now you'll see this will actually change to what we put as my variable, which is 20. We could change that to 2000, and then that will work. Or we can even change it to some text. This is a variable coming into the web page. Ta-da! Fantastic. So we've gone over a few different concepts here and I've tied them all together so that you have this complete view very early on, because I find when you're learning this stuff, it's so helpful to have a complete view and see how it's all working. However, one thing that we need to make sure of is that you're able to put the different pieces together. So let's go over things step by step. The first thing that we went over was creating variables. So if you pause the video now and just try to explain to yourself what a variable is. Essentially what a variable is you're storing a small amount of data, or well, a certain amount of data, let's say. So what you're doing here is you're saying, I want to store data. This is the name of the variable, so this is where you can find it. So for example, you can't, if I were to again put var my variable, and I gave it a different value, this would actually override this one. So this would get deleted, and this would be the new value that appears. So you can't store two different bits of information in the same variable. I'd have to call this a different variable, so I could call it different var or something like that. The important things to keep in mind when you're naming your variables is you can't use numbers at the start. You should also very much avoid using any of these at the start. Just focus on using letters for now. Of course, you could do my underscore variable, things like that. That's entirely possible. But for now, just focus on using letters because it keeps it much more simple at the start. So we learned how to create variables by saying var, then giving a name of whatever we want. Then this is the value that we're actually storing as the variable. So we've stored some text here. We could store numbers, we can store a lot of different data types, which we'll go on to in the future. But once we've learned how we can store these variables, we've seen how we can actually start applying those, so we can start using them in functions. Now this is where before we had empty brackets in our functions, this is where we started to add it in. So for example, we could put x in here. And then here, we just have to make sure that we refer to it in our function. So we're saying there's going to be a value coming into our function, but we don't know what it is. So here's a placeholder. We're going to call it x for now. And when the function's actually used, we'll give you the value. And then within, we're saying, okay, we want to change the inner HTML here of paragraph, of the ID para, to this value. We don't know what it is, but when we call the function, we'll give you a value. So then here, when we're actually calling the function, we could have put anything in here. We could have put in the number 30, for example. And then as you see, it changes to 30. But what I wanted to show you is that the variables can now be put into the function. So we can change this to my variable. Fantastic. And then that's using my variable, which is 50 up here. So hopefully you're starting to understand how this works. So, I mean, one of the things I really believe with variables is that as we go through these lectures, you'll just come to see how they're being used so often. So don't worry too much about everything included in here right now. Just keep in your mind that var is how you basically state, I'm creating a variable, and then you give your variable a name and you give it a value. Then what we stepped up to, and you don't have to worry too much if you don't get this right now, because we will be going over it many, many times in the future. What we've done is in the empty brackets, we've said there's going to be a value provided for this function when it's called. And that data, or that value, should be used at some point, and it's being used here. And then when we're calling our variable, when we're calling our function, we're giving it a value here. In this instance, we're actually using a variable that's being stored thanks to our JavaScript. So what I recommend you do is have a go at creating a variable like this, and then if you're feeling up to it, try and do exactly what we've done here. Create a function and then use the value of your variable to call the function, and then have the function change to that. If you're not feeling up to that, then you could do something a bit more simple, and you could do something like this. Just alert, you might remember we used this before, alert x. So then this time what will happen is we'll just get an alert. So if that's a bit easier for you, go ahead and do something like that. But make sure you have a play with it. Even if it's confusing to you right now, just give it a go. See how far you can get. And I assure you in the coming lectures, it will all start to make a bit more sense. So have a play as always, and then I'll see you in the next lecture.